and it changes so quickly. But then I've started to notice just how quickly, like growing up in the 2000s, it really felt like anti-racism was just the absolute default. It was just like everyone was against racism in the 2000s, and everyone looked down on it. And now it's started to come back, and it's crazy just how quickly what felt like a really progressive cultural movement just has gone the other way. It works like such a perfect distraction because the big topic that all the like the very far right people in England talk about is like cultural invasion. They talk about, our culture being erased, migrants are changing our culture. So there's this sort of story that's being sold to them, which is there is a foreign entity that's coming in and taking something of yours from you. Meanwhile, it's literally happening through these billionaire networks and all these think tanks and actual ownership over valuable things because we have such a low resolution and a lack of true understanding of politics in this country just as a general average, that people don't understand what ownership is, and that ownership is a lot basically the most important thing. So there is someone coming in and taking your country, but that is typically incredibly wealthy people buying up everything and owning everything. But we get sold this as like a diversion tactic, which is like that is really happening. So the way we get them to look the other way is by saying, look, it is happening, we agree, but it's happening from migrants and it's happening from this. And it's really scary. It's very much happening in the UK.
Jimmy and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. Was as the narrative started to sort of creep into social media or into the media about a wealth tax, and Rachel Reeves had announced this wealth tax and they were going to push a wealth tax, suddenly there was a massive sort of wave of anti-immigrant sentiment coming out in the press, in the media. Why? Because who owns the media in the UK? It's owned by the people who don't want wealth taxes. It's no surprise. I mean, I was having a discussion not too long ago about it's a long story anyway. There was a woman economist, and basically my dad had given a presentation, and she said to my dad, no, your opinion about climate economics is not valid because you don't support the settled science that there exist two genders, whatever. and I, and my dad and I were talking, and so I started to dig into it. She came after me as well, and I said, all I said was, I don't know what you're referring to about settled science, it, but it doesn't matter. So I started digging, and then I found that in the last 5 years, over $300 million had been spent on anti-trans media campaigns.
Jesus
About
Christ.
80% of that money came from the fossil fuel industry. Why does the fossil fuel industry care so much about trans people? Well, because it means we're not talking about climate change. It's these constant media distractions and this constant sort of trying to wrestle the narrative to where they want to point things. And that's what I'm doing in the work that we want to do with the Truth Collective is to say, look, this is a social media company. This is what it does. This is how it tries to control the narrative, and this who's paying for it. And this is why. And the more people understand that, and that's why Jimmy's so important, because re-education programs or getting people to understand the information environments they work in, or, at least understand what are the cultural fights we're having and why we're having them is really important. You don't hear a lot of, especially in America, about education programs on social media, or what is media, what is new media, and then how do you navigate those spaces. Where those education programs exist is largely in countries that border Russia. Why? Because the Russians have been running these disinformation and misinformation campaigns for the last 80 years, trying to, influence people on their borders. Um, so that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, and that's why I wanted Jimmy involved, um, because he understands that kind of how that on a personal level he understands it, um, and he knows how to come out of it, and it's not easy. That's why we need good people involved in what we're doing.
The interesting thing talking to you guys is that whether we look at Donald Trump or Pierre Poilievre up here in Canada, or name your pick, every country's got this rising far right movement. Um, the like you mentioned, Chris, there is this connective tissue behind the scenes, and it all comes down to a handful of extremely rich white dudes who are kind of funding this stuff, right? I mean, if you trace it back far enough, you're going to find that a lot of this money is coming from the same places. A lot of the funding. When Donald Trump was first elected, I think the mistake that many Americans made is they thought that, well, this is just a temporary moment of insanity, and the fever's going to break, and people are going to wise up. And they were able to get Trump out of office in 2020, but there was really no remedial action taken to correct the problems behind the scene. And that money continues to flow in. It continues to get more powerful. I mean, Chris, you talked about Larry Ellison, probably going to be the future owner of, or part owner of, TikTok. That is absolutely terrifying. And people don't understand what that means. It doesn't sound that scary when you think about it. Like, billionaire investor takes stake in social media company, not a sexy news story, but especially once you start tracing back media ownership, you see that the playbook that corrupted so many minds in America with Fox News and the Rupert Murdoch playbook, it is very much bleeding into other countries. Up here in Canada, a lot of our news outlets are basically American owned now. And
Correct.
people up here are getting subjected to American talking points. We
Yeah.
were able in the last election to deflect that when Pierre Poilievre, who was very clearly just plagiarizing out of the MAGA playbook. His policies were proven to be wildly unpopular at the time. There was a big backlash because of Donald Trump. Not only did he not win the prime ministership, he couldn't even win in his own riding. And that's
No,
a whole
he
story
just
in and of itself. But they're going to keep pushing this. He's still pushing his MAGA playbook. And as long as the money keeps coming in, eventually society seems to just cave under pressure if enough money is thrown at it, because we're not doing anything to stop this. And I mean, we can all talk about free speech and the importance of being open to ideas, but when a bunch of billionaires are buying up media and consolidating that and starting to use that to influence politics, which we have absolutely seen to an insane degree since Trump got reelected, this isn't really free speech anymore. This is basically Orwellian, just thought control at this point.
correct, 100% paid and paid for.
It's so interesting seeing how like it's really made me reflect. Sometimes the right wingers say stuff, and if you listen to what they say and don't take their sort of diagnosis, they sometimes come up with interesting stuff. And they'll talk about, like how Western culture values freedom, liberty, equality, and we're scared of losing that to Muslims with different attitudes. Like, that's something they say. And it kind of like vaguely touches on this thing of what actually creates progressiveness. And I'm starting to notice just how the opposite of what they say, just how whimsical progressiveness is. Like, when you look back in the 90s in England, a wife could be raped by her husband, and that wouldn't get you put in jail. It was illegal for, like, you couldn't marry someone of the same gender very recently. Like, and society, when you would poll them even 20, 30 years ago, their attitudes on those things were what we would consider like very regressive, and it changes so quickly. But then I've started to notice just how quickly, like growing up in the 2000s, it really felt like anti-racism was just the absolute default. Like, I remember when we was playing, like, we had the World Cup would be on and football, there was like these bands that were black and white, and it was called Stand Up, Speak Up, and everyone wore them. It was just like everyone was against racism in the 2000s, and everyone looked down at it. And now it's started to come back, and it's crazy just how quickly what felt like a really progressive cultural movement just has gone the other way. And it's made me start to value that, like, institutions and mass education, continuous mass education, is the only thing that keeps and retains these supposed Western cultural values, which are just cultural values. I think that framing's a bit stupid, but this idea. And then when I was making a video recently, and I go through like Iran, because I see the similarities in the Christian conservative um, thing coming out of America. And the irony when it's applied in England, we're trying to sort of reject Islam or whatever. The irony that it almost identically mirrors what happened in Iran, which caused the Islamic Revolution, which was a rejection of liberal progressive values, which were brought in under the Shah of Iran, because the Americans and the British, we came in and we put in the
Wanted oil.
Shah. And yeah, but they basically they gave social liberalism, but not economic, like actual economic prosperity to the people. So people were being sold socially progressive ideas: women can drive, women, and blah blah blah. But they weren't dealing with their material. They weren't dealing with their living standards, their housing, their actual personal financial situations weren't being dealt with. And so they ended up rejecting outright the concept of liberalism. And it's just so interesting to me how I'm seeing, like, in my lifetime, liberal progressive attitudes being rejected, um, all in this sort of weird vain attempt to stop Islam and immigrants. It's like this complete irony. It just made, yeah, it's kind of made me cement the fact that I don't think progressive values are innate to any culture. I think you get a brief moment where maybe it's culturally relevant, and then you have to cement it into law and into like education, because it will just go. It can go very quickly if it's overpowered by billionaire lobbyists and all these media control.